Everyone knows a soccer match started a war. That is the story. That is what the documentaries say. That is the name the whole world gave it, the football war, and it is wrong. The question is not why 3 qualifying matches for the 1970 World Cup caused 2 countries to go to war. The real question is why 2 governments needed a war in the first place, and what they were hiding when they pointed their own people at each other. That answer starts not in a stadium, but in a field, in a law, in 300,000 people who became the wrong nationality at exactly the wrong moment. His name was Oswaldo Lopez Arellano, and by 1969 he had a problem. He had seized power in Honduras through a military coup, and the men who might have stopped him had been silenced, bought, or broken. The American banana companies had taken the best land. The poor had nothing. The economy was rotting, and the people were starting to ask the question that every barely legitimate ruler fears most. Who is responsible for this? Lopez Arellano had an answer. It just wasn't the true one. By the 1960s, roughly 300,000 Salvadorans were living and working inside Honduras. They had come across because El Salvador had a problem of its own, one that had been building for decades. In El Salvador, 5% of the landowners controlled 70% of the land. 200,000 peasant families had nothing. No plot, no stake, no future. So they crossed into Honduras, where the land was vast and sparsely settled, and they built lives. They farmed, they raised children, some had been there for 20 years. In 1962, Honduras passed a land reform law. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it was a weapon. The law stripped Salvadoran migrants of the land they occupied, regardless of how long they had been there, regardless of what they had built, and redistributed it to native-born Hondurans. By 1967, it was being fully enforced. The land was seized, the people were expelled, and in the months before a single World Cup qualifier was played, Honduran vigilante groups were moving through border communities, beating Salvadorans, burning homes, killing dozens. That was May 1969, before the first ball was kicked. Lopez Arellano had not solved his country's poverty. He had redirected his people's anger at a visible, vulnerable group and called it reform. What happened next was not caused by soccer. It was caused by what Lopez Arellano had already done, and the matches were just the moment it caught fire. The first qualifier was played on June 8th in Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. The Salvadoran team arrived the night before and did not sleep. Honduran fans surrounded the hotel. Drums, car horns, firecrackers, stones against the windows from dusk until kickoff. The team walked into the stadium, exhausted, and lost 1-0 to a goal scored in the dying seconds. Both governments seized on the violence immediately. Both nationalist presses amplified it. The score barely mattered. What mattered was the story each side was now telling its own people. The return leg in San Salvador on June 15th was worse. Honduras arrived to the same treatment. Broken windows, dead animals thrown through the hotel ventilation, crowds pressed against the walls through the night. Before the match, instead of raising the Honduran national flag, El Salvador hoisted a torn rag in its place. The stadium erupted. Honduras lost 3-0. Their players were driven home in an armored bus, with rocks bouncing off the roof. But the government of Honduras was not finished with its Salvadoran scapegoats. In the weeks between the second match and the deciding playoff, the expulsions accelerated. Tens of thousands of Salvadorans streamed back across the border. On foot, in bad condition, some beaten, many having walked 50 or 100 miles to reach the crossing. They arrived in El Salvador, which already had no room for them, with nothing. President Fidel Sanchez Hernandez now had his own crisis on his hands, and he had his own political answer for it. The deciding match was played in Mexico City on June 27th, neutral ground with 1,700 police inside the stadium. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time. The decisive goal came in the 11th minute of added play. The celebration on one side and the fury on the other spilled out of the stadium into the streets. The same day, the day of that match, El Salvador formally severed all diplomatic relations with Honduras. 2 weeks later, on the morning of July 14th, a Salvadoran C-47 transport, escorted by 2 Cavalier Mustangs, crossed into Honduras and dropped bombs on Toncontin Airport in Tegucigalpa. The 100-hour war had begun. What happened next is one of the strangest footnotes in the history of aviation, almost entirely unknown outside of military history circles. The Salvadoran Air Force was flying World War II-era propeller aircraft. Mustangs and Corsairs, fighters that had last seen combat over Europe and the Pacific a quarter century earlier. Honduras was flying them too. Both countries had inherited the finest piston-engined fighters ever built, and on July 17, 1969, in the same week that Apollo 11 was carrying 3 men toward the moon, they used them against each other for the last time in history. Honduran captain Fernando Soto lifted his Corsair out of the haze above Honduras and into the afternoon light. He encountered 2 Salvadoran Mustangs engaging a 3rd Corsair and dove in. In 2 separate dogfights that afternoon, Soto shot down 3 Salvadoran aircraft, 1 Mustang and 2 Corsairs. They were the last air-to-air kills ever recorded between propeller-driven fighters. While Neil Armstrong was preparing to walk on the moon, the last piston dogfight in the history of aviation was being fought over Central America, in a war most of the world never heard of. The last propeller dogfight in history, same week as the moon landing, and almost nobody knows it happened. Drop in the comments. Which part of this war do you think history buried the hardest? On the ground, El Salvador had pushed 8,000 troops into Honduras, advancing along the main roads and briefly threatening to reach the capital. But without air cover, the advance stalled. The Organization of American States intervened and demanded a ceasefire. El Salvador refused the first request. Then the OAS threatened economic sanctions, which both countries, small and poor and dependent on trade, could not survive. On July 18th, 4 days and roughly 100 hours after the shooting started, a ceasefire was signed. El Salvador did not withdraw its troops immediately. They held their position for 2 more weeks, using the leverage to demand protections for the Salvadorans still inside Honduras. On the 2nd of August, they finally pulled back. The border closed. The war, officially, was over. Thousands had been killed. The exact toll disputed, with official military counts putting combined combat deaths under 200, while broader estimates, including civilian casualties, climb into the thousands. 300,000 Salvadorans were displaced and expelled, most of them walking back across a border into a country that had no plan for them and no land to give them. They settled where they could. They became squatters in their own country. The overcrowding that had sent them to Honduras in the first place was now worse, not better. The peace treaty between El Salvador and Honduras took 11 years to sign. The root causes, land inequality, statelessness, the systemic failure that had produced 300,000 landless people in a country the size of Massachusetts, were never resolved. And because they were never resolved, the pressure kept building. In 1979, 10 years after the football war ended, El Salvador collapsed into civil war. It lasted 12 years. 75,000 people died. The returning refugees, the broken land system, the governments that had used their own citizens as political pawns and then abandoned them, all of it was in the soil by then. The football war did not cause the Salvadoran civil war directly, but the historians who have studied both conflicts understand the connection. The 100-hour war did not solve anything. It just rearranged the weight that eventually crushed the country. Captain Soto's Corsair, FAH-609, is on display today at the Air Museum in Honduras. It still carries the 3 white silhouettes painted on its cowling, 2 Corsairs and 1 Mustang, kill markings from a war that lasted 4 days, that most of the world missed entirely because a more famous event was happening elsewhere. Soto died in 2006, the last pilot to score aerial victories in a propeller-driven fighter. The men who made the decisions that actually caused this war, Lopez Arellano, who signed a land reform law he knew would make 300,000 people homeless, Sanchez Hernandez, who ordered an invasion framed as protection while solving nothing for the people he claimed to be defending, They are not remembered the way Soto is. That is usually how it goes. The politicians who ignite these things rarely carry the weight of them. The people they used as fuel carry it for generations. Everyone says a soccer match started this war. The matches didn't start it. The matches were just the moment it stopped being deniable. The deeper we dig into the past, the more we understand the present. I'm Zombo, and there's always more to discover.